welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I will be discussing an analysis and a retelling of history from the perspective of the true history if we were to align these historical facts. Now, in the film with Joaquin Phoenix, known as Napoleon, one might find a perspective that Napoleon was the one that was winning his battles. But when you look at the perspective now of Bonaparte, whom himself was essentially placing battles, but who he was placing battles in line of was essentially what would dictate history. What was the Napoleon? In the fictional depiction, of Napoleon within said movie, if one were to analyze the moments or the letter writings of Napoleon to his wife, one might find one particular notion. These letters were not written by Napoleon, or at least not by Bonaparte. And understanding the true history regarding the alignments of these particular stories, one might have to find the perspective of the man winning said battles, which was Thomas Alexandre Dumas, whom was the one that was winning said battles for Napoleon. And in said movie, if we were now to analyze the true historical recordings, such as behind the Battle of Austerlitz, one might find that in said battle, it is not as depicted in said movie. In the Battle of Austerlitz, it was Thomas Alexandre Dumas who won said battle single-handedly. In the conquerings of Napoleon Bonaparte, we see him take on an alternate personality. Because you see, if you were to look at the name Napoleon, you would find essentially the true derived leader of this emperor, of this empire. What might have been a nappy lion? The nappy-headed lion that was the true emperor. And in the adoption of the Napoleon name, Bonaparte essentially took on a new identity so that he would be believed to be Thomas Alexandre Dumas, to be believed he was the one winning said battles. But now when you look at the placements of said battles, you might find that the story of Thomas Alexandre Dumas does not start particularly at his life on the sugar plantation. You see, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was the son of a baron. Correct. And this son of a baron, whose this baron particularly was, meant to be the next in line. He was the brother of the king of France. Now, upon Thomas Alexandre Dumas arriving to the mainland of France, he became a very popular attraction compared to the average height of say 5'5" of the normal Frenchman. Thomas Alexandre Dumas was of a mulat color, standing 6'2", with green eyes. And this man was believed to be the most beautiful man in France. He was the son of a slave mother to a baron. And in his lineage, one would find the heir to the throne. Now, why might we see a different telling of such story? Of not only just Napoleon, but of said Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Upon his arrival in France, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was told if he wanted to marry, he would have to climb to the rank of general. Now, in said story, we find the opening stories of his son, Alexandre Dumas, which in the telling of Alexandre Dumas' father's depiction of such stories, we find the beginning of such story. Upon arriving to a general, we see him immediately sent off to perish in jail the day of his wedding. The moment Thomas Alexandre Dumas was sent off to jail, we see the tale of Edmond Dantes, the tale of Thomas Alexandre Dumas, which in this particular tale is the notion of a letter being delivered from Napoleon. And who is it that must deliver this letter? Edmond Dantes, also known as Thomas Alexandre Dumas. And this letter from said Napoleon was meant to liberate France. Now, within said imprisonment of Thomas Alexandre Dumas, we then find a particular notion of his writings to his wife. And in the writings of his wife, within said imprisonment, whom is it that was receiving said letters? Whom is it that had placed Thomas Alexandre Dumas within said prison in order to ascend to become the Napoleon? One would see that Bonaparte essentially took the true heir of France, which was of a mulat color, a mix between Caucasian and African. And in the French Revolution, Napoleon did not see this as a fit ruler of France. The Bonaparte did not see Thomas Alexandre Dumas as a fit ruler of France. And so he sent him off to be imprisoned. To which, during the tale of Edmond Dantes, we then see the escape of Thomas Alexandre Dumas from Le Château d'If, the castle of If. From Le Château d'If, we see the escape and the return of Thomas Alexandre Dumas take place within said Count of Monte Cristo, which through this particular tale, we find that Edmond Dantes essentially becomes the wealthiest man in France. Wealthy enough through his battles to essentially buy back France. He becomes the landowner of the largest amount of property within said France. Now, within the Count of Monte Cristo, we see a tale of vengeance, which turns into a justice. When analyzing the true history behind France and the Bonaparte wars that were placed in said regions, we might find that the Battle of Cairo was actually the first battle. It was simply rewritten. Thomas Alexandre Dumas was sent as a general to the Battle of Cairo, which from his escape or retreat upon finding that Bonaparte had sent him on a death mission, we then find that Thomas Alexandre Dumas, seeking to return to France in order to ascend the throne at said particular time, we might find now that he is captured just outside of Italy. Pardon my dogs. Now, in being captured outside of Italy, we find that he is then imprisoned at the Chateau d'If. And every battle pursuing beyond Napoleon, or the Bonaparte battles taking place within said European landscape, were specifically put in place to stop Thomas Alexandre Dumas from coming back to France. And in stopping Thomas Alexandre Dumas, he would then take on the identity of Napoleon, the Napoleon, the Napoleon, the nappy-headed lion, known as Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the true ruler of France. And in the stories told within said Joaquin Phoenix fictional re-representation of said story of Napoleon, we actively find that the historical landmarks are told from a different perspective. In the true historical facts regarding said battles, we might find that it is Thomas Alexandre Dumas whom is fighting these battles. And in the fictional re-representation of the Napoleon movie, you might find that the tale of Napoleon within said film is actually the tale of Thomas Alexandre Dumas. There was a reversal within said history, specifically to prevent a nappy-headed lion from ruling France. And the Napoleon, whom was Thomas Alexandre Dumas, writing said letters to his wife to marry, one might find that in these particular letters is where we find the true representation of Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Who might have been this great Thomas Alexandre Dumas? Well, we might find in these particular stories, such as the Count of Monte Cristo, the Man in the Iron Mask, the Three Musketeers, Robin Hood. We might find that within such stories, we see the true depiction of Alexandre Dumas' father. And if we were to align said historical writings and fictional writing, in the analysis you might find that the particular battles that Bonaparte had particularly placed within said Europe were specifically to stop the return of Thomas Alexandre Dumas, in order to stop him from returning to Paris in order to stop him from obtaining what was his in birthright. In the French kingdom, we see that it was actually Bonaparte that became the emperor, rewriting said history. And it was Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the true king of France, that was then sent to perish. Where might we find the opening letter? We would find it written the moment that Thomas Alexandre Dumas was imprisoned within Chateau d'If. And each of these particular letters were then renamed and retold by said Bonaparte. The moment you can place this particular notion, you'd find where the true king sat. And within said letters, in said writing, is encoded from the perspective of Thomas Alexandre Dumas. The real Napoleon, the real emperor of France, was Napoleon, the nappy-headed lion. Now, why might we have called him the nappy-headed lion? The Black Devil. Because as a man of color, at 6'2", said Thomas Alexandre Dumas was of a lion-like nature within said people. The average Frenchman came up to his chest. And in ancient times, it was great men that led great civilizations. Now, in understanding that this rewritten history is meant to steal the true King of France. In the Napoleon Bonaparte's ventures, we hear him speak of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. I'm not going to retell the whole story, but in the understanding, specifically towards the battles that which the Bonaparte had laid, and if you were to analyze the battles at which Thomas Alexandre Dumas fought, you would then find that in the fictional telling of Napoleon, with the Joaquin Phoenix representation of said historical events, one would find that each of these particular battles were in fact a reverse order. And at the beginning was the end, and at the end was the beginning, in order to fight the true emperor, the true king. Is this the ultimate truth? I'll let that up to you to decide. As a descendant of said man, as a descendant of Thomas Alexandre Dumas, I have come to know the story of my ancestor rather quite well within his works of writing depicting his father. But if one were to look at the depictions of said stories, then one might find the factual events of said wars fought by Thomas Alexandre Dumas for Bonaparte were specifically to stop him from becoming and returning home. Thomas Alexandre Dumas was the true Napoleon. But history was rewritten by Bonaparte in order to achieve the emperor status of France, which he had zero tie to said lineage. Now, where might we see a rewriting of said story? Where might we see Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the true King of France? If you wish to understand the story of the true history, I would invite you to invoke the works of Alexandre Dumas, and within your own particular dive into said novels or movies, one might find the truth regarding the future of France. Thank you.